The evening air hung heavy with anticipation as James Rochester stood before the antique mirror in his lavish Manhattan office. Around him, the meticulously curated artifacts of his success stood sentinel. A bespoke buy-in suit, its fabric whispering of a price tag exceeding most people's monthly income, Italian leather shoes gleaming with an almost unsettling perfection, and cufflinks that had once graced the cuffs of his grandfather, a titan of industry. He gazed at these emblems of his gilded cage, the same weary resignation with which a prisoner might regard the bars of his cell. Tonight, however, he refused to be confined. Instead of reaching for the familiar opulence, his hand hovered over a lesser shelf, landing on a simple, unassuming navy blazer. He remembered buying it years ago, during a fleeting moment of rebellion against the suffocating expectations of his world. It fit adequately, though lacking the sharp, architectural precision of his customary attire. He paired it with dark, well-worn jeans and comfortable leather boots, an ensemble designed to blend into a crowd rather than command it. The mere sight of him leaving the office so uncharacteristically dressed would have sent his meticulously organized assistant into a state of near apoplexy. But she was long gone for the evening. James had made it abundantly clear that he wanted no questions, no concerned glances, no thinly veiled warnings about appearing anything less than impeccably proper at the Manhattan Children's Hospital Charity Gala. The truth, though he rarely voiced it even to himself, was that James had reached a breaking point. At the age of 32, he was one of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. His sprawling real estate portfolio stretched across 15 states. His investment firm employed hundreds of people, their livelihoods inextricably linked to his decisions. His name appeared with unwavering regularity in the hallowed pages of Forbes and Bloomberg, a constant reminder of his public persona. Yet, with each staggering achievement came a suffocating sense of isolation, of being perceived as nothing more than a walking, talking checkbook rather than a flesh-and-blood human being. People approached him with barely concealed calculations shimmering in their eyes, their intentions transparent. Women smiled with an almost unnerving precision, their enthusiasm meticulously calibrated to the ever-fluctuating size of his net worth. Men, driven by ambition and a desperate hunger for success, competed for his approval with the relentless fervor of athletes chasing the elusive gleam of Olympic gold. He had grown utterly weary of conversations that revolved solely around mergers and acquisitions, interest rates and profit margins. He longed for conversations that delved beyond the superficial, conversations where he might discuss books, music, or the quiet beauty of the changing seasons without being met with blank stares and thinly veiled impatience. The gala was scheduled to commence at 8 o'clock in the penthouse ballroom of the Century Tower, a monument to his own ambition. James made his entrance at 9:10, deliberately late enough that the initial formal social protocols would have dissolved into the more relaxed atmosphere of casual mingling. The venue was a breathtaking spectacle of unapologetic extravagance. Crystal chandeliers, each a constellation of shimmering light, hung suspended from the towering 30-foot ceilings, casting a dazzling glow that transformed the room into the shimmering interior of an enormous jewelry box. Tables draped in midnight blue silk held elaborate centerpieces of pristine white roses intertwined with branches of gleaming silver. A string quartet occupied a discreet corner of the ballroom, their delicate melodies nearly swallowed by the incessant murmur of countless conversations and the occasional bursts of manufactured laughter. Remarkably, blessedly, no one recognized him. James felt the profound difference immediately. He moved through the throng of impeccably dressed guests as simply another attendee, another well-dressed man contributing to a worthy cause. A woman he had met on 2 previous occasions offered a polite nod, but displayed no flicker of recognition, no glimmer of acknowledgement that she knew who he was. An investor he had politely but firmly declined 6 months prior looked directly at him and bestowed the generic, impersonal smile one reserves for complete strangers. The anonymity was intoxicating, liberating. James accepted a flute of chilled champagne from a passing server, its bubbles tickling his nose, and found himself genuinely smiling for what felt like the first time in months. A genuine, unguarded expression that reached his eyes. He wandered toward the far edge of the ballroom where a spectacular display of desserts, had been meticulously arranged on tiered platforms, a sugary Everest of temptation. There were delicate poutiers dusted with shimmering gold leaf, elaborate chocolate sculptures of impossible delicacy and intricate detail, and multicolored macarons in jewel tones arranged with the precision of precious stones. James found himself studying them with a newfound sense of genuine appreciation, not because they were inherently expensive or represented status, but because they were clearly the product of extraordinary skill and artistry. He had dined at 3 Michelin-starred restaurants in the past month alone, yet the intricate craftsmanship displayed in this dessert arrangement moved him far more than any of those meticulously curated meals. Someone, he realized, had poured genuine passion, a piece of their very soul, into these delectable creations. She was arranging a fresh platter of ruby-red raspberry rose tarts when he arrived at the display, so completely absorbed in her work that she remained blissfully unaware of his presence until he spoke. "The construction on these is extraordinary," James said, gesturing towards one of the tarts with his champagne flute. "The subtle piping of the cream filling, the delicate placement of the candied rose petals. Most people would simply pipe the filling in a simple swirl. This approach clearly requires much steadier hands and a far greater degree of artistic precision." The woman looked up, startled, and James found himself unexpectedly struck by the raw genuineness reflected in her expression. There was no immediate sizing up, no subtle assessment of his potential value, no strategic calculation of his worth. Her eyes held only the open, earnest enthusiasm of someone deeply passionate about her craft, someone who genuinely loved what she did. "You know about pastry work?" she asked, carefully setting down her tray of tarts and giving him her undivided attention. "I know very little actually," James replied, suddenly feeling a little self-conscious under her frank gaze. "But I can certainly appreciate the skill and precision required to create something so beautiful." She smiled, a radiant, unguarded expression that lit up her entire face. And it was nothing, absolutely nothing, like the calculated, practiced smiles he had grown so accustomed to receiving. This smile was spontaneous, unforced, the pure, unadulterated smile of someone who had been caught in the act of doing something they genuinely loved. "I'm Olivia," she said, wiping her hands on a small towel tucked into the pocket of her practical black catering uniform. "I'm the head pastry chef for the event. I created these." "James," he said simply, extending his hand. "And these might just be the most impressive thing I've seen all evening." They shook hands, her grip surprisingly firm, and Olivia laughed, a light, melodious sound without a trace of performance or artifice. "That's either very kind of you," she said, her eyes twinkling with amusement, "or you haven't seen much of the event yet. The silent auction items are supposedly extraordinary. There's a weekend at a private villa in Tuscany worth $50,000. I would take these tarts over a week in Tuscany any day," James said, and meant it completely, surprising himself with the depth of his sincerity. Olivia's eyes sparkled with genuine amusement. "You're either being extraordinarily nice," she said, tilting her head slightly, "or you have a genuine passion for pastry that I've somehow failed to detect through your job description, which I'm guessing isn't professional dessert enthusiast." "I work in real estate," James said, choosing his words carefully, technically true, if somewhat of an understatement. He owned more real estate than some small countries produced in a year, but the deliberately vague phrasing created the right impression, a sense of normalcy he hadn't felt in years. "Mostly Manhattan development. It's not particularly glamorous." "Most of what people do isn't particularly glamorous," Olivia said matter-of-factly, turning back to arranging her tarts with practiced ease. "That doesn't make it any less important. My day involves a lot of standing, early mornings, and precise temperature control. There's absolutely nothing glamorous about it. But the work matters to me. If I can create something beautiful that people enjoy, that feels significant somehow." James found himself completely captivated, drawn in by her unpretentious honesty and quiet confidence. She wasn't being modest or self-deprecating in a way that invited contradiction or sought validation. She simply believed what she was saying and had no need to convince him, or anyone else, of her worth. It was a refreshingly stark contrast to nearly every interaction he had in his regular life, a beacon of authenticity in a sea of carefully constructed facades. "Would you sit with me for a moment?" James asked, suddenly emboldened by a sense of hope he hadn't realized he'd been missing. "I realize you're working, but perhaps during a break?" Olivia glanced at the dessert display, now fully arranged and looking absolutely perfect, a testament to her skill and dedication. She checked her phone, then looked back at him with that same unguarded smile that had captivated him from the start. "The desserts are set for at least another hour," she said. "I can take a short break. There's a quieter area near the terrace if you want to escape the crowd." They walked together toward the terrace, and James found himself experiencing a genuine flutter of nervousness, a sensation that had absolutely nothing to do with business negotiations or high-stakes deals. Olivia moved with the comfortable, unself-conscious confidence of someone completely at ease in their own skin. She didn't seem aware of the striking picture she made. A woman in a simple black uniform moving through a room filled with people adorned in designer gowns and glittering jewels. If anything, she seemed more genuine, more real, than anyone else in the room. The terrace was indeed quieter, offering a breathtaking view of the glittering expanse of Manhattan, stretching out into the darkness like a fallen constellation. The city lights reflected off the polished surfaces of the buildings like stars brought down to earth, a mesmerizing panorama of urban beauty. Olivia walked to the railing and breathed deeply, as if drawing strength from the city itself. "I love this view," she said, her voice soft. "I took this catering job partly because it gave me access to these kinds of spaces. I grew up in Queens, and my parents worked long hours. I didn't see many places like this." "Where do you live now?" James asked, genuinely curious. "Upper West Side," Olivia replied, a note of clear pride in her voice. "I saved for 3 years to get my own apartment. I also manage the restaurant where I work as head pastry chef. It's a smaller place, not fancy, but it's become quite popular. We're talking about opening a second location in Brooklyn." "That's impressive," James said, and his admiration was entirely genuine. "Most people would have stayed in stable, predictable jobs. You chose to build something." "I had to," Olivia said simply, her gaze fixed on the city lights. "I couldn't imagine doing anything else with my life. My mother thought I was crazy. She still thinks I'm crazy. But there was something inside me that just knew this was what I needed to do. So I did it." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the hum of the city a gentle backdrop to their conversation, and James realized that he was experiencing something rare and precious. He wasn't being assessed for his net worth or his connections. Olivia was simply being herself, sharing pieces of her story with someone she had just met, because the conversation felt natural, unforced, and genuinely engaging. For the first time in years, James felt truly seen, not as a symbol of wealth and power, but as a person. "I think your mother must be proud now," James said softly, turning to look at her. "I think she is," Olivia agreed, a wistful smile playing on her lips, "though she still worries I'm not dating enough and that I'm too focused on work." James felt an unexpected flutter in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since he was a teenager. "Are you too focused on work?" Olivia turned to face him fully, and something shifted in her expression. There was a sudden awareness in her eyes, a flicker of recognition that this conversation had moved beyond casual pleasantry into something more meaningful, something potentially deeper. "I was," she said carefully, her voice a shade softer. "But standing here right now, I'm wondering if maybe there's something I've been missing." James stepped closer, drawn by a force he didn't fully understand, an almost magnetic pull that defied logic and reason. This woman had somehow slipped past every carefully constructed defense he had erected around himself, not through manipulation or artifice, but through the sheer force of her simple, unadorned authenticity. "I'm very glad you took a break," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The evening unfolded in a series of stolen moments snatched between her work obligations. James found excuses to return to the dessert display, lingering near her while she replenished the dwindling supply of tarts and cakes. Olivia, in turn, made excuses to take additional breaks, meeting him on the terrace or in the quieter corners of the ballroom. They talked about books and music and the subtle nuances of the city, about how the skyline looked completely different depending on where you stood in relation to it. They talked about their dreams and their failures, about the courage it took to build something meaningful in a world that constantly pushed you toward compromise and conformity. As the gala began to wind down near midnight, the music growing softer and the crowd beginning to thin, James realized that he didn't want this evening to end. For the first time in a long time, he also realized, with a sharp pang of guilt, that he couldn't tell her who he really was. Not yet. Not when everything between them felt so fragile, so untainted by the corrosive influence of his wealth and power. So he did something he had never done before, something that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. He asked for her number without explaining how or even if he would use it, and she gave it to him without hesitation, a gesture of trust that both humbled and frightened him. Another small miracle in a night full of unexpected magic. 3 weeks had passed since the gala, 3 weeks that felt like a lifetime, and James Rochester found himself behaving in ways that would have sent shockwaves through his conservative board of directors. He left crucial meetings early, prioritizing the possibility of a chance encounter. He walked aimlessly through Central Park at sunset, simply to feel the cool evening air on his face. He spent countless afternoons in a small, unassuming restaurant on the Upper West Side called the Candlelight Bakery, watching Olivia work through the kitchen window, captivated by the focused grace of her movements, the almost balletic precision with which she created her edible masterpieces. He had taken her to dinner 7 times, each meal a carefully chosen experience designed to reveal a different facet of the city he loved. They had walked the High Line, hand in hand, marveling at the urban landscape. They had visited the Metropolitan Museum, losing themselves in the beauty of art from across the ages. They had shared conversations that stretched late into the early morning hours, their words flowing effortlessly, their laughter echoing in the quiet stillness of the night. And not once, not even in the most vulnerable moments, had he told her the truth about who he really was. Each time he contemplated revealing his real identity, fear, cold and paralyzing, gripped him. The fear wasn't about outright rejection, though that possibility certainly lingered in the back of his mind. It was something deeper, something far more profound. He was terrified that the moment she learned he was James Rochester, the billionaire, something fundamental would irrevocably shift between them. The way she looked at him would change, the unguarded warmth in her eyes replaced by something more calculating, more strategic. The easy, unforced conversations would become stilted and self-conscious. The authenticity, the very essence of what drew him to her, would evaporate like morning mist in the harsh glare of sunlight. So he continued his careful omission, rationalizing his deception by telling himself that he was simply waiting for the right moment, that he was protecting something precious and fragile that still felt too vulnerable to expose to the harsh realities of his world. Olivia, perceptive and intuitive, had undoubtedly noticed his evasiveness, though she had never mentioned it directly. James could see it in the subtle hesitations before her smiles, the almost imperceptible pauses before she answered certain questions, the careful way she avoided delving too deeply into his professional life. She was a deeply intelligent woman, and she was waiting patiently for him to trust her enough to be honest, to share the truth, however uncomfortable it might be. And every day that he failed to tell her, he knew he was betraying that trust, eroding the foundation of their burgeoning relationship. The revelation, as it often does, came not from James himself, but from circumstance, a cruel twist of fate that felt somehow even worse, even more unforgivable than a deliberate confession. He had taken Olivia to a small, intimate restaurant in Tribeca for their 8th date, a hidden gem he had discovered years ago, tucked away on a quiet cobblestone street. It was a warm Friday evening in late September, the kind of night when the city felt vibrantly alive with possibility, its energy palpable in the air. They sat at a cozy corner table, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, and James was regaling her with a humorous story about a disastrous real estate deal from his early years, a tale of youthful hubris and humbling failure. Olivia was laughing, her eyes sparkling with genuine amusement, when 3 men approached their table, their movements radiating the purposeful stride of people accustomed to getting exactly what they wanted, when they wanted it. One of them was Marcus Whitmore, a prominent venture capitalist who had been relentlessly trying to partner with James on a massive development project for months. A project that would reshape the very skyline of the city. James had politely but firmly turned him down on multiple occasions, unconvinced by Marcus's vision and wary of his overly aggressive tactics. But Marcus was the type of individual who viewed rejection as merely a temporary negotiating position rather than a definitive answer, a challenge to be overcome rather than a boundary to be respected. "Rochester," Marcus said, his voice booming, pulling out a chair without so much as a perfunctory invitation. "Wondered if I might run into you. Been trying to reach your office all week. We need to talk about the Manhattan Harbor development." James felt the entire evening shift, the atmosphere growing heavy and tense like tectonic plates grinding against each other beneath the surface. He saw Olivia's expression change, a subtle flicker of calculation dawning behind her eyes as she processed the name, the familiar surname that echoed through the city's boardrooms and headlines. "This isn't the time, Marcus," James said, his voice tight with barely suppressed irritation. "Just a few minutes," Marcus continued, seemingly oblivious to James's obvious discomfort or, more likely, deliberately ignoring it. "I've got a new investor, someone with serious capital, someone who shares my vision for the waterfront. We could move forward on this project, and we could move forward now. 50 million in initial funding I'm talking about." "Not now, Marcus," James repeated, his voice taking on a sharper edge, but it was too late. The damage was done. Olivia was looking at him with an expression he had never seen before, an expression that was far more complex than simple anger. It was the face of someone watching the very foundation of something they valued crack apart in real time, the dawning realization that everything they believed to be true was, in fact, built upon a lie. "You're James Rochester," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the restaurant. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, a confirmation of her worst suspicions. "Olivia, let me explain," James started, reaching out to her in a gesture of desperate supplication. But Marcus, ever oblivious to the nuances of human interaction, interrupted with a hearty laugh. "Explain what? That you're one of the most successful developers in the entire country? That you probably have more money than most small countries? That you own a significant portion of Manhattan real estate? Come on, James, why would you hide that?" Marcus, finally noticing the palpable tension at the table, seemed to belatedly realize his monumental mistake. He excused himself quickly, mumbling something about urgent business elsewhere, but the damage was irreversible. The words had been spoken, the truth revealed, and the carefully constructed facade had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Olivia set down her wine glass with a delicate click, her movements betraying none of the turmoil churning inside her. She didn't meet James's pleading eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was remarkably steady, but possessed a sharp, crystalline edge that had never been there before. "How long were you planning to keep that from me?" she asked, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond him. "It's not what you think," James said, hating how defensive he sounded, how weak and utterly inadequate his words felt. He reached for her hand across the table, desperate for some physical connection, some tangible reassurance that everything wasn't about to fall apart. She pulled her hand away gently but deliberately, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. "Isn't it? Because what I think is that you lied to me. For 3 weeks you told me you worked in real estate development, painting a picture of a modest career, a normal life. You asked me about my dreams and my struggles and my fears, and all the while you were living in a completely different world than the one you were describing." "I didn't lie," James said, his voice cracking with a mixture of desperation and shame. "I told you I worked in real estate. You were deliberately misleading me?" Olivia replied, her voice now laced with a pain that cut deeper than any anger ever could. "There's a vast difference between not telling me everything and actively constructing a false impression of who you are. You let me believe you were someone you weren't." "I was someone I wasn't," James said quietly, the truth of her words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "That's exactly the point. The person I am in my real life, the public persona, that's not who I am, not the person I want to be." That's the person everyone sees based on money and connections and power. You saw me, the real me, and I was terrified that if I told you the truth, you would stop seeing me and start seeing my bank account instead. That wasn't your decision to make, Olivia said, her voice rising slightly as she stood up from the table. The other diners were starting to notice their increasingly heated conversation, but she seemed not to care, her focus entirely on James. You should have given me the choice to decide who I wanted to be with. Instead, you took that choice away. You made me fall for someone who doesn't actually exist. I exist, James said, the desperation creeping into his voice, threatening to overwhelm him. I'm right here. Everything I told you about my feelings, about who I am as a person, that was all true. It was the most honest I've been with anyone in years. How am I supposed to know that? Olivia asked, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, her voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and betrayal. You've already shown me that you're willing to deceive me when it suits your purposes. Why should I believe anything you say now? Before James could formulate a response, before he could even begin to articulate the depth of his regret and the sincerity of his feelings, Olivia reached for her coat, her movements betraying the careful composure she was desperately trying to maintain. She didn't move with anger, but with the deliberate, almost clinical movements of someone trying to hold themselves together, to prevent themselves from completely falling apart. James stood to follow her, to plead with her to stay, to beg for a chance to explain. But she held up her hand, stopping him in his tracks. I need time, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to think about whether what we had was real, or just something you constructed to escape your actual life for a few weeks. A carefully crafted illusion designed to entertain you. She turned and left the restaurant, disappearing into the bustling crowd on the sidewalk, leaving James sitting alone at the table, feeling as though the world had suddenly tilted off its axis, throwing everything he thought he knew into complete disarray. The waiter approached nervously to ask if everything was all right with the meal, and James could only shake his head, unable to muster the words to explain the depth of his despair. Nothing was all right. Everything was falling apart. The next morning, James found himself doing tasks that he would normally delegate to his meticulously efficient assistant. He instructed his driver to pull up articles about himself in various publications, both online and in print. He compulsively read through interviews and profiles, scrutinizing photographs of himself at various fundraisers and high-profile business events. He saw himself through the cold, impersonal lens of public perception, a powerful, almost unapproachable man in impeccably tailored, undoubtedly expensive suits, his expression always guarded, always calculating, always strategizing. He barely recognized the man in the pictures. He also did something he had never done before, something that felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. He went to the Candlelight Bakery not to furtively watch Olivia through the kitchen window, but to speak with her directly, to confront the consequences of his actions and beg for a chance to make amends. Thomas Bradford, Olivia's second-in-command at the restaurant, greeted him at the door, his expression a carefully crafted mask of polite neutrality. Thomas was a man in his late 50s, with streaks of gray artfully woven through his dark hair, and an air of quiet competence that suggested he had already heard some version of what had transpired, and that he was not particularly impressed. She doesn't want to see you, Thomas said, his voice not unkind, but firm and unwavering. She's been in the back all morning working on the new menu for the Brooklyn location, throwing herself into her work, which is what she always does when she's hurting. I need to apologize, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I need to do it in a way that actually means something, in a way that conveys the depth of my regret. Thomas studied him for a long moment, his gaze unwavering, his expression unreadable. If you love her, he said slowly, choosing his words with deliberate care. And I'm not convinced that you do, since you lied to her repeatedly, then the apology can't be about convincing her to forgive you. It has to be about understanding what you did wrong, truly understanding the impact of your actions, and genuinely committing to changing, to becoming a better person. What do you mean? James asked, feeling a glimmer of hope flicker within him. She spent 3 weeks believing she knew you, Thomas said, his voice softening slightly, but still retaining its underlying firmness. She let her guard down. She allowed herself to be vulnerable. She opened her heart to you. And then she found out that the entire foundation of that vulnerability was based on a deception, a carefully constructed illusion designed to protect you, not her. You can't fix that with a romantic gesture or pretty words. You have to earn back her trust, brick by brick. You have to prove to her, through your actions, that you can be honest with her, even when honesty is uncomfortable, even when it reveals your flaws and insecurities. James left the bakery feeling humbled and slightly overwhelmed, but also strangely determined. He knew that Thomas was right, that he had a long and arduous journey ahead of him, a journey that would require him to confront his deepest fears and insecurities. Over the next week, James embarked on a period of intense self-reflection, doing something he had never done in his professional life. He told the truth, the unvarnished, unfiltered truth, even when it was difficult and uncomfortable. He called his business partners and told them exactly what he was thinking instead of filtering his thoughts through layers of careful calculation and strategic maneuvering. He spoke with his assistant about his genuine concerns regarding her excessive workload, acknowledging her sacrifices and offering concrete solutions to alleviate her stress. Instead of attending another lavish fundraiser, he had dinner with his mother and, for the first time in years, discussed his genuine fears and anxieties about his relationships rather than simply maintaining the facade of the successful son who had everything figured out. But more importantly, he began writing to Olivia. Not emails or text messages, but actual handwritten letters, penned with painstaking care on high-quality paper and delivered by a trusted courier, ensuring they reached her hands directly. In these letters, he was brutally honest about his failures, his insecurities, and the profound loneliness that had plagued him for so long. He wrote about the way money had created a seemingly impenetrable barrier between him and authentic human connection, about how terrified he had been to lose her, the one person who had seemed to see past the wealth and the power to the real person beneath. He didn't ask for forgiveness, knowing that he didn't deserve it. He didn't promise that everything would be perfect, because he knew that life rarely followed such predictable narratives. He simply laid himself bare on paper, exposing his rawest emotions and his deepest vulnerabilities, and left it for her to do with what she would, trusting that she would see the sincerity in his words. On the 8th day, as he was sitting alone in his penthouse apartment, staring out at the city lights, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed Olivia's name, and James felt his heart leap into his throat, nearly choking him. He took a deep breath and answered the phone, his voice barely a whisper. "Hello? I read your letters," she said, her voice sounding both familiar and distant, her words devoid of preamble. All of them. James felt his heart rate accelerate, pounding in his ears like a drumbeat. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for whatever was to come. "I meant every word," he said, his voice filled with a raw sincerity that he hoped would somehow transcend the distance between them. "I know you did," Olivia said, and her voice was softer than it had been at the restaurant, the sharp edges smoothed by a hint of something that sounded suspiciously like understanding. "I've been thinking about what you wrote, about what I wanted to write back, the things I said in my head but never dared to send. And I realized something. I was angry not because you're rich, although that certainly complicated things. I was angry because you didn't trust me enough to be honest with me, to give me the chance to make my own decision. I would have understood. I might have been scared, but I would have understood." "I was scared, too," James said quietly, the words tumbling out of him in a rush of honesty. "More scared than I've ever been in my life." "I know," Olivia replied, her voice even softer now. "Your letters made that clear. So here's what I think. We're going to start over, but this time we start knowing exactly who each other is, all of it. The good parts and the complicated parts and the parts that don't fit neatly into any category." "What does that look like?" James asked, his voice filled with a cautious optimism. "I don't know yet," Olivia admitted, a hint of a smile in her voice. "But I want to find out with the real you. All of the real you." They agreed to meet the following day at a coffee shop neither of them had ever been to before, a neutral space where they could begin again, building their relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. That evening, James did something he had never done before in his adult life. He sat in his luxurious penthouse apartment, surrounded by the trappings of his wealth and power, and he felt genuinely happy, not because he had won or succeeded or overcome a formidable obstacle, but because someone had given him the most precious gift of all, a second chance. The coffee shop was called Morning Light, a small, unassuming corner establishment in the East Village with mismatched furniture, walls adorned with local art, and the kind of welcoming atmosphere that came from genuine care and attention rather than professional interior design. Olivia arrived first, ordering a simple black coffee and settling at a table near the window, her gaze fixed on the bustling street scene outside. When James entered the coffee shop, his heart pounding in his chest, Olivia felt an unexpected somersault in her stomach, a visceral reaction that both surprised and reassured her. This was the moment that would determine everything, the moment that would decide whether they had a future together or whether their brief, intense connection was destined to fade into a bittersweet memory. He looked different, she thought, studying him intently as he approached her table. Not in a dramatic or superficial way, though she did notice that he was wearing the same simple clothes he had worn at the gala, clothes that bore no trace of expensive designer labels or calculated presentation. What was different was his posture, the way he moved through the room, the almost palpable sense of vulnerability that radiated from him. There was an openness to him that hadn't been there before, a willingness to be seen for who he truly was, without the carefully constructed shield of wealth and power. "Thank you for seeing me," James said, his voice soft and sincere as he sat down across from her. He didn't reach for her hand or offer any grand gestures. He simply sat and looked at her with an expression of such raw, unadorned honesty that Olivia felt her anger and resentment begin to dissolve like sugar in hot water, replaced by a tentative glimmer of hope. "I almost didn't come," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, her gaze fixed on her coffee cup. "I spent the entire morning. Here's what struck me as I reread your letters, Olivia," he began, his voice laced with a newfound sincerity. "You were forthright about your initial deception. You didn't attempt to diminish it, to paint it in a softer light. You acknowledged precisely what you had done and, more importantly, why, without offering flimsy excuses. That honesty speaks volumes." They spent hours immersed in conversation, the city lights twinkling like distant stars outside the window. James unveiled the tapestry of his childhood, recounting the moment wealth had infiltrated his family's life and irrevocably altered its course. He spoke of relationships withered by the insidious doubt of whether affection stemmed from genuine connection or from the allure of his financial standing. He confessed the crushing loneliness of being perceived as a walking, talking investment portfolio rather than a human being burdened by fears, insecurities, and dreams that transcended quarterly earnings reports. Olivia listened intently, and in doing so, she unearthed the vulnerable boy beneath the billionaire's armor. The boy who had learned to shield himself by meticulously controlling every facet of his life and image. The boy who had been so starved for genuine connection that he had recklessly risked everything by deceiving the very person who had made him feel truly alive. "I understand the motivation behind your actions," she finally admitted, her voice soft yet resolute. "I don't condone the deception itself, but I grasp the fear that fueled it. And I understand because I, too, harbor my own fears. I was terrified when I discovered your true identity, not simply because of the lie, but because I believed you belonged to a world to which I could never truly belong." "You do belong, Olivia," James countered with unwavering conviction. "You belong anywhere you choose to be. That's the profound lesson I've learned. Your worth isn't measured by your net worth or the connections you possess. Your worth resides in the essence of who you are. That integrity, that passion, that unwavering honesty, those qualities are more valuable than anything I could ever acquire." Olivia offered a tentative smile, her eyes still holding a flicker of caution. "So where do we go from here? How do we realistically navigate this path forward?" "Carefully," James replied, a hint of playfulness in his tone. "And honestly, I believe we need to integrate our worlds, to introduce them to each other in an authentic way. I want you to meet my family, my colleagues, the people who know me professionally. And I want to immerse myself in your world, your restaurant, your craft, your friendships. No more hiding from each other's lives. We need to weave them together. That sounds utterly terrifying, Olivia confessed, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. It is, James readily agreed, his gaze meeting hers with unwavering sincerity. But I believe it's also essential. I can no longer sustain the pretense of being someone I'm not. And you shouldn't have to contort yourself to fit into a fabricated version of my life that I created solely for you. We need to build something genuine, something that encompasses all facets of who we are. In the weeks that followed, they embarked on a journey of genuine integration. James escorted Olivia to a charity benefit, this time appearing as himself without disguise or concealment. He proudly introduced her to his colleagues and business associates, speaking of her with such palpable affection that everyone instantly grasped her significance in his life. When dismissive remarks surfaced from former acquaintances who couldn't fathom his connection with someone not born into wealth, James simply severed those superficial ties. He discovered that maintaining social connections based on mutual financial interest paled in comparison to surrounding himself with individuals who appreciated Olivia for the remarkable woman she was. Olivia, in turn, navigated James' world with growing self-assurance. She attended galas and business dinners, and instead of shrinking into the background, she radiated her authentic self in every room. She posed insightful questions about real estate development, offered keen observations about architecture and design that impressed seasoned industry professionals. She refused to be anything other than who she was, and that authenticity became her most compelling asset. People were drawn to her precisely because she didn't try to perform. But more significantly, James fully immersed himself in Olivia's world. He showed up at the Candlelight Bakery during the bustling lunch rush, working alongside the staff in the kitchen, mastering the intricate choreography of food preparation. He attended the grand opening of the Brooklyn location, where he had discreetly secured funding for the expansion without ever seeking recognition. He forged a friendship with Thomas Bradford, who eventually revealed that Olivia had always envisioned a partner who could appreciate her world, not someone who would seek to whisk her away from it. The true test arrived 6 months later when Victoria Winters, James' ex-fiancée, resurfaced in the city. Victoria had long been a fixture of the social scene, and her engagement to James had seemed a perfect fit to everyone within their exclusive circle. They came from similar backgrounds, adhered to the same unspoken rules, and ostensibly desired the same things, or so everyone had believed. When Victoria witnessed James with Olivia, she voiced her disapproval at a high-profile event, delivering veiled yet pointed remarks about Olivia's background and implying that James was simply experiencing a fleeting infatuation that would eventually dissipate. James could have responded in a manner that mirrored his past behavior, with strategic distance or cutting remarks. Instead, he took Olivia's hand in a public declaration of affection, introduced her to Victoria as the woman he was deeply in love with, and turned away, leaving Victoria speechless. Later, he confided in Olivia that Victoria had seemed somehow diminished in that moment, less imposing than she had appeared during their engagement. He realized that it was because he had evolved into a more complete version of himself, and Olivia had been instrumental in that transformation. 1 year after the charity gala where their lives had intersected, James stood in the private dining room of an exclusive restaurant, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar anxiety. He had meticulously planned this moment, but no amount of preparation could quell his nerves. Olivia was in the powder room, and he was alone with a small velvet box nestled in his pocket. When she returned, she was greeted by a breathtaking transformation. Delicate pastries crafted by her own hands adorned elegant display tables, samples of the desserts she had perfected over years of dedicated work. Photographs lined the walls, capturing cherished moments from their relationship, chronicled by a photographer he had secretly hired. There were images of the gala where they first met, the coffee shop where they had decided to start anew, the restaurant where they shared their first real dinner after their reconciliation, the penthouse where they had watched countless sunrises together, and countless other snapshots that told the story of their extraordinary journey. "What is all this?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "This is us," James said, his voice thick with emotion as he reached for her hand. "This is who we are when we are honest, present, and committed to building something real together. And I want to continue building with you for the rest of my life. He then knelt on one knee, his gaze locked on hers. Olivia gasped, covering her mouth with her free hand as tears streamed down her face. I know I caused you pain, and I acknowledge the mistakes I made that cannot be erased. But I also know that you saved me, Olivia. You showed me what it truly meant to be seen and valued for the person I actually am. You gave me a second chance when I didn't deserve it. And I promise you that I will dedicate the rest of my life to earning the trust you have placed in me. Olivia, will you marry me? She uttered yes before he could even complete the question. Pulling him to his feet and embracing him in a kiss that felt like both a beginning and an ending, a culmination of everything they had been through. It felt like all the careful constructions and pretenses dissolving, leaving only the unadulterated truth of what they had created together. The wedding took place 6 months later at the Candlelight Bakery, which was closed for the evening to host the intimate celebration. James's family was present, and Olivia's family was present. Business associates mingled with restaurant staff. Victoria Winters was notably absent, having finally come to terms with the fact that she had lost something she could never fully appreciate. But her absence mattered little because everyone in attendance understood the profound significance of what they were witnessing. They were witnessing two people who had learned to see each other completely and had chosen to build a life founded on that complete visibility. Olivia herself designed the wedding cake, a masterpiece of edible art that captured the very essence of their relationship in layers and flavors. There were notes of bitterness, representing the inevitable difficulties of real life. There were notes of sweetness, reflecting the fundamental kindness of love. There were contrasting textures, symbolizing the distinct worlds from which they came. And at the very center was a simple truth that held everything together. They had chosen each other completely and without reservation. During his vows, James shared words that would resonate with everyone in the room for years to come. He confessed that he had once believed his greatest achievement was building a real estate empire. But he had been mistaken. His greatest achievement was learning to be vulnerable. His greatest achievement was learning to trust. His greatest achievement was building something real with Olivia, something that could not be bought, sold, or leveraged for profit. In her vows, Olivia recounted how she had built her career by being meticulous and unwavering in her commitment to quality. But the most important thing she had ever built was the courage to forgive someone who had caused her pain. She acknowledged that she had learned that the most beautiful things in life were not born from careful calculation, but from risking everything and trusting that things would ultimately work out. She said that James had shown her that sometimes the greatest luxury was simply being seen by someone who loved you exactly as you were. As they cut the cake together, their hands intertwined around the knife, James whispered words that only she could hear. He told her that he loved her, not in spite of the complications, but because of them. He cherished that she was not the easy choice, that they had not simply stumbled into happiness, but had painstakingly constructed it from the shattered remnants of their first attempt. He loved her because she had demanded his honesty, his presence, and his complete self, and she had made him a better person by refusing to accept anything less. Olivia smiled, and it was the same captivating smile that had drawn him in at the dessert display at the gala. The same unguarded and genuine smile that had made him realize what he had been missing in his life. But now, that smile carried the added depth that comes from enduring hardship, having chosen to move forward together, stronger than before. Months turned into years. The Candlelight Bakery expanded to 3 locations, and Olivia gained recognition as a rising star in the culinary world. But she remained intimately involved in the day-to-day operations because the work still held the same profound meaning for her. James continued to grow his real estate empire, but he adopted a different philosophy, building spaces for people rather than simply spaces for profit. He created affordable housing developments alongside luxury properties, and began mentoring young entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds, recognizing the invaluable contributions of varied perspectives. They purchased a house in Connecticut with a spacious kitchen where Olivia could experiment with new recipes and a comfortable home office where James could work away from the constant distractions of his corporate headquarters in Manhattan. They decorated it together, their choices reflecting both their individual aesthetics. Expensive art pieces adorned the walls alongside cherished family photographs from Olivia's childhood. There was a professional-grade kitchen in a house that also featured a cozy reading nook. There was a library filled with books about architecture, baking, love, and philosophy, reflecting the breadth of their combined interests. On quiet evenings, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Olivia sometimes asked James if he ever regretted that fateful night at the gala, if he ever wished things had unfolded differently. James always offered the same unwavering answer. He admitted that he regretted the initial deception, but he didn't regret anything that followed, because the honesty that blossomed in its wake was worth more than all the careful constructions that had preceded it. "I would endure the pain all over again," he would say, his voice filled with conviction, "if it meant ending up exactly here with exactly you." Olivia would lean her head against his shoulder, and they would share a comfortable silence born of being truly known and truly loved, not loved for what they possessed, what they could provide, or what they could offer, but simply loved for being exactly who they were. Years later, when people asked them the story of how they met, they tailored their responses depending on their audience. To business associates, James would say it was at a charity gala where he encountered someone who irrevocably changed his perspective on what truly mattered in life. To friends, Olivia would say it was at a dessert display where she met a man who possessed the courage to risk everything for the truth. To strangers who sensed the undeniable love between them, they would simply smile and say they had found each other when they needed each other most. The truth, however, was far more intricate and far more beautiful than any single version of the story. The truth was that they had both been incomplete in different ways. James had achieved remarkable success but remained isolated, powerful yet disconnected, wealthy but spiritually impoverished. Olivia had been building something meaningful, but doing it alone, creating beauty but questioning if anyone truly saw it. They had come together both by accident and by design, by circumstance and by conscious choice. And they had forged something that transcended the limitations of either of their individual lives. On their 10th anniversary, they renewed their vows, not in a grand venue, but in the humble candlelight bakery, the place where they had first begun to know each other authentically. The desserts were once again crafted by Olivia, and they were more exquisite than they had been a decade earlier because her skills had only deepened with time. Thomas Bradford was present, now retired but still offering Olivia guidance on special projects. James's family was there, transformed by their son's happiness into more genuine and loving people than they had been before. Olivia's family was there, radiating pride for the woman their daughter had become. As they stood before the assembled guests, now with 10 years of shared history etched between them instead of just one night of magical connection, James took Olivia's hand and shared words that would have seemed unimaginable on that first evening at the gala. He said that the best decision he had ever made was to shed his masks and allow himself to be vulnerable. He said that the richest moment of his life wasn't when he closed his first major deal, but when a woman in a black catering uniform had told him that she took her work seriously because it mattered. Olivia, in turn, said that she had built her career by refusing to compromise on quality. But the most important compromise she had ever made was the decision to entrust her heart to someone who had caused her pain because she saw the genuine desire for change reflected in his eyes. She affirmed that true strength wasn't found in perfection but in the willingness to grow, to evolve, and to become a better version of oneself for someone you deeply loved. As they walked through the bakery hand in hand after the ceremony, past the tables where both their worlds had collided, merged, and transformed into something entirely new, they understood something fundamental about love that most people only glimpse in fleeting moments. They understood that the greatest love stories weren't the ones that unfolded effortlessly. They were the ones where two people chose each other repeatedly, day after day, not because it was convenient, but because the alternative was to return to a life that felt fundamentally incomplete. They had met by chance at a charity gala where one person was pretending to be invisible, and another person was genuinely present. They had nearly been undone by deception and misunderstanding. They had rebuilt from broken trust into something stronger than what they had before. And they would continue to build, continue to choose each other, continue to risk everything on the unwavering belief that love was worth the vulnerability it demanded. The glittering city lights of Manhattan shimmered in the distance beyond the bakery windows, the same lights that had captivated them that first night on the penthouse terrace. But those external symbols of wealth and status paled in comparison to the profound connection they had forged with each other. They had both learned that the greatest luxury in life wasn't a penthouse apartment, a thriving business, or a flawless life devoid of complications. The greatest luxury was finding someone who saw you completely, knew you entirely, and loved you anyway. And they had found that. They had each other, and that was everything they had ever truly needed. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to click like, share this story with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more meaningful stories.